You talked before about Paul already, which I think for some people might be a surprise to say, let's start with Paul rather than let's start with the Gospels. So could you say a little bit for you about why you do engage with Paul in this conversation? And then some of, as you mentioned, whether we're taking everything as from Paul's hand or from a divergence of hands, some of the movements that happen there, because does Paul follow that theologian and say, I'm going to defend one heresy here, or do they move through a couple different phases of that?
No, it's a great question, and I kind of reluctantly came to Paul. I gave a presentation at a church once, and I was talking about Paul, and it was part of a series. And one person came up. The first question I got afterwards was, "Do you like Paul? Like, it sounds like you really don't like Paul." And I said, "Well, I'm sorry if I gave that impression, but I just tend to stick with Jesus and the Gospels." And the deeper I got into this project, the more all those years of teaching Intro New Testament every semester and spending a third of the course on Paul's letters, the more connections I started to see. And I thought, okay, is this like, the film A Beautiful Mind with all of the strings connected together, and this is all just imaginary and it's in my head? Or is it really this tangled? And I just kept, every time I would look over here, I would see Paul. And it's like, but I'm reading Luke. And I would look over there when I was reading John, and I was like, well, there's Paul again. And he's just this creepy guy who lurks in all the corners. And I came to believe that everybody who wrote a canonical gospel, and I always qualify an eventually canonical gospel, because there were a lot of gospels that didn't make the canon. But the ones that became canonical, I think that those four were all reading some of Paul, and actually think that that's a big question for New Testament scholars, is to sort of see the relationship. And there are folks doing excellent work on this now, of how much of Paul had such and such gospel writer read. And so we start with Paul because he wrote us our first New Testament texts, and he's writing them 20 years after the crucifixion, but he's also writing them about 20 years before the first gospel. Mm-hmm. So just having that background knowledge, because you have a PhD in New Testament, I started to see more and more relationships to Paul. And the lowest Christology you could see at work in Paul is at the very beginning of Paul's letter to the Romans, which is generally regarded as his masterpiece. It's the longest letter, which is why it's the first one in the Pauline corpus in the canonical New Testament. And a lot of times people say, oh, these were occasional letters. They were written ad hoc, and they were written for particular congregations. And I would argue that's not always the case, because Paul says things in 1 Corinthians like, this is my rule in all the churches. And so I think he fully expected his letters to circulate more widely. But boy, when we get to Romans, that is Paul, and that is years of Paul working out his theology in a lot of argumentation and saying, this is what I believe. And I do think that it's a treatise. I mean, it starts with an addressee, I, Paul, write to you, and it ends with, and say hi to all of these folks. But everything in between is a theological treatise. And I would argue that point till sun goes down. So he opens in chapter 1 with a pretty interesting statement. If you read it literally, he says that Jesus is born of the flesh, but he is declared to be Son of God by virtue of the resurrection. And that is considered a relatively low Christology if we're trying to ask the question, at what point did the human Jesus become divine? Was he always somehow divine, or was there a moment in history when he became divine? And I'll go on to explain that I don't think that this is all that Paul has to say, the real Paul, and this is all that he thinks. But it is the lowest Christology you could have as a formulation, because it sounds like until the resurrection, that Jesus was not the Son of God. And I don't think that's all that Paul thought. and I'll say why, but I want to linger on that. Why would he say what he says there in Romans that sounds like that? And I think the key is that's what it took for Paul to come to believe that Jesus was the Son of God at all. Now, the book of Acts gives you this vivid description that tells you the same story 3 times in 3 different ways. There's always a light, there's always a voice, and there's always somebody falling down. But it's Paul's conversion, as it's commonly called, which is not a very helpful term, as my students will tell you. But all Paul ever says is that God saw fit to reveal his Son to me. And so he mentions that in passing in Galatians, and you want to just stop and stick your finger in the text and say, can you please, a paragraph, please?
Say a little bit more here.
Something about it. And he doesn't. He just moves on. That God revealed his Son to me. But what we also know from Paul's letters is that he is persecuting the people that we would call the earliest Christians. The earliest people who believed that Jesus was the Son of God were claiming that Jesus had risen from the dead. Paul did not believe this. Why is that? Well, Paul did, in fact, believe in such a thing as resurrection of the dead. He self-identifies as a Pharisee. Pharisees believe in resurrection. It's important to point out, with Easter, resurrection's kind of a given, right? But by the time of Jesus, the idea of resurrection of the body was really only about 200 years old as a belief within Judaism, and it is one that not all Jews believed in. The Gospels tell us as much. The week that Jesus dies, he's debating with Sadducees whether there is such a thing as resurrection or not. It doesn't come along until the Maccabean revolt. And the long story short is God promised in Torah that if Jews kept the commandments, God would bless them, and if they broke the commandments, he would curse them. And so something like the Babylonian exile happened 600 years before Christ. And so the thinking is, well, I guess we must have done something wrong because this sure looks like a curse to me. Never again. We shall keep the commandments, right? So the Maccabean revolt comes along because the Greeks have taken over. And this is, again, about 200 years before the ministry of Jesus. And the idea is you Jews are too different. Why are you so different? Be more Greek. Stop doing all these things that make you different. And the Jews say, over my dead body. And the Greeks say, have it your way. And we have what we come to call martyrdom, right? Mm-hmm. They die because they would rather die than break the commandments. Now we have a serious problem when it comes to the justice of God, theodicy being the big theological term for the problem of evil. If God is just, then why do all these bad things happen to all these good people, especially these pious martyrs who would rather die than keep the commandments? And so we enter into Judaism. One place in the book of Daniel, chapter 12, the only place you will find in the entire Tanakh or the Jewish scriptures any notion that there is such a thing as resurrection of the dead. That's a text that's written in light of the Maccabean revolt. And the idea is those pious martyrs will be raised back to life. They will live forever immortal and shine like the stars. And boy, will they get the last laugh, because the ones who killed them, they're going to be raised up too. But they are going to live forever in eternal conscious torment, right? So not all Jews believe this, but Paul did. But for him, resurrection and final judgment are inextricably linked. I always tell students, it's like an exam. You have that dream that you've overslept and it's final exam and then you can't find the room, right? You do not sleep through final judgment. If it happens, you're not going to miss it. Moses will be there. David will be there. The patriarchs will be there. And it will be quite a big affair when the end of history comes. And so Paul does not believe that Jesus has been raised from the dead, because he does not think you can disconnect resurrection from final judgment. And he has some sort of religious experience that leads him to believe that, okay, I was wrong, at least in part. Jesus has been raised up, and he calls him in 1 Corinthians the first fruits of the resurrection. So God has raised Jesus back to life to show us that resurrection is real, and it must mean that final judgment is coming any day now. And Paul thought he would live to see it. He thought it would happen in his lifetime. He was quite obviously wrong about that because we're still here. He could not have imagined that the world would carry on for 2,000 years. But his belief, his change of mind that Jesus was raised from the dead gets him thinking about what the implications of that must be. And probably his earliest formulation of that is, well, then Jesus has to be Son of God. And so then he uses the language of mystery. And I like to highlight that because, at least in my experience, Catholic students understand it better than Protestant students, because the Catholic tradition has used consistently the language of mystery to say, this is utterly incomprehensible and it's going to sound to you like nonsense, but hear me out. And so then the church explains its position. When you disregard this language of mystery, it starts to sound, very fundamentalist, like all of this is obvious. It's like 1 + 1 is 2 in base 10. And so why don't you believe it? And so I think we have to, when we're talking about something as complicated as Christology, we can't operate with that kind of simplicity. We have to acknowledge it. And so Paul starts to use this language of mystery. In the fullness of time, God revealed his Son, and God sent his Son. And when we get this language of sending, we then kind of say, okay, so was the Son already there in some way to then be sent into the world to be born of a woman? And Philippians is then this key text, crucial text for early Christology, the so-called Christ hymn, where we have a pre-existent Christ who then is born of a woman, who lives, who dies, who is raised from the dead, and then goes back into the heavens. And then the key for that is, it's not as though by virtue of the resurrection, Jesus has attained some new status for the first time. It is that he has reattained the status that he had before he ever entered the world in the first place. That, I argue, is a couple steps up on our staircase to a higher Christology, to have a Jesus who existed in some way, not in human form, but in divine form, and he became human. He chose to become human and suffer this humiliating death, and he had to, the fancy word is kenosis in Greek, but it just means to pour something out. He had to pour out at least some of that divinity, or else you couldn't have killed him on the cross, right? If he were totally a divine being, he would have been invincible. He'd still be hammering, and he'd still be saying, I'm trying to tell you guys, you can't kill me. But it turns out he is in fact mortal, and he dies a gruesome death. But then he is raised up, and that's what Easter celebrates. And so from Romans, it sounds like, okay, maybe God just adopted him as son at his resurrection. And Philippians gives you a much fuller accounting of Jesus's complicated interplay of humanity and divinity, that he was divine. Doesn't say that he emptied all, doesn't give us a quantity, just that he had to have emptied some divinity, at least enough to become a real human and get you the both and then he lived and died, and then he was raised again. So he is in some way both human and divine, but it becomes really important to say, but it's not as though he became totally human and wasn't divine at all during his earthly ministry, because that becomes too low of a Christology. You've run into the ditch, because if you're denying humanity, even for a period, then, or denying the divinity during a human lifetime, that's not going to play either. So we then get to the highest rung of Paul's letters, which I am in agreement with the consensus of scholarship that Paul didn't write. Colossians and then Hebrews, which even in the earliest church, Origen in Alexandria in the 200s famously says, only God knows who wrote the letter to the Hebrews. But both of those make a really important claim. that everything was created through the Son of God. And I always joke with students. I say, what, you didn't know that? And you should answer, no, I didn't know that, because all I did was read literally every other one of Paul's letters, none of which mention that Jesus created the very world that he was going to enter into. That seems like pertinent information. And it's only those later texts that, at least with Colossians, claims to be written by Paul. Hebrews doesn't claim to be written by Paul, but kind of it's Paul-ish. So it gets very closely associated with Paul. And they make this claim that Jesus created the world. And Hebrews is even doing some really interesting work of saying, for a time, namely during his human lifetime, he became lower than the angels. Well, why do you say that? Because angels, if you just read in Hebrew or in Greek or in Latin, if you just read what Christians call the Old Testament, what Jews call the Tanakh, angels are literally called sons of God. And so you get what I call creator Christology as a necessary corrective to say, lest you just think of Jesus as some other son of God, like all the others, who just came and showed up and acted like he was human. No, that's not what happened. He became lower than the angels because you can't kill an angel and you could kill Jesus, but that actually makes him superior because he died and he came back and no other angel ever did that. And so Hebrews is doing all of this work for you to say, not only do we believe that Jesus created all things, we specifically mean that the angels, the demons, all of those other immortal beings, they came into being through him because the Son of God was there prior to creation and was God's agent in creation. There was already a Son. And so we go from he becomes Son of God by virtue of the resurrection to, well, yes, he is Son of God by virtue of the resurrection, but he also was pre-existent because he had to be sent into the world as the Son of God and by the way, he created the entire universe. That's the staircase for Paul's letters. Yeah, you can climb the whole staircase with Paul. Or the letters associated with Paul.